Good afternoon, UG2. I come to you, as you can see, today from a graveyard, in particular a Christian burial ground close to Tollygunge. And I'm here for a reason. I'm here to talk about graveyard poetry. Had things been otherwise, it would have been nice to actually take this class in a graveyard with all of you here. I will be teaching Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, but since that's not possible, we'll have to make do with what we have. I think it was the Norwegian philosopher Tonenson who said that to think about anything but death is evasion. And in that sense, all of human cultural endeavors in literature and art is nothing but one great act of delusion, of evasion, intended to make us forget that all the time we are falling through the air, and that all the time we are moving towards our death. So arguably literature in itself is a kind of escape from death, a kind of evasion of death. But there is one type of literature which which is not true. This is the literature of death, which is graveyard poetry. It was a genre that was popular in the 18th century. It is a part of the culture of sensibility, and it involved poets contemplating death in a kind of melancholy mood and setting while wandering in graveyards. And that's where we'll start today, but of course it doesn't really begin there, this obsession with death. Even though Tonenson says literature is evading death, we may also point out that much of human literature has tried to confront death, has tried to come to terms with it as well. If you go back to our oldest literature, if you look at, for instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh, it is in some sense trying to come to terms with death, trying to come to terms with mortality. Again, if you go through Old English poetry, if you look at Old English lyric poetry, the Seafarer, the Wanderer, Dior's Lament, the Ubi Sant tradition, which begins there. Where are those that came before us? Again, an attempt to come to terms with the fact of death itself. This, of course, continues on through the medieval period and into the Renaissance, during which, of course, death became spectacularly visible on the stage as it had never been before. You would see the spectacle of death being acted out, and stages would be filled with props, for instance skulls, and this reminds me, of course, of Hamlet, which is in a sense one long meditation on death. It begins with Hamlet's father's death, and Hamlet cannot come to terms with his father's death, and he spends much of the rest of the play trying to do so. And there's this one famous scene called the gravedigger scene, in which it's in the last act of the play. Hamlet has returned from England and is in a graveyard. He's wandering in a graveyard, very much in the memento mori tradition of remember your death, remember your mortality, contemplating mortality. And here he chances upon a grave digger, someone who is a professional digger of graves, and they begin to have a conversation about death and about dead bodies, a rather morbid conversation, but then Renaissance drama is a rather morbid kind of drama. And I thought I'd just do this scene with you, just sort of act it out, because it's such an important scene within the Memento Mori tradition. Informing Gray's elegy, of course, informing numerous other reflections upon death that were to follow. But, and this would be better if I had my skull with me, but we can imagine that I'm holding a skull, because Hamlet encounters the gravedigger, and the gravedigger tosses him a skull, and Hamlet catches it, and he's looking at this skull, and he says, whose was it? And the gravedigger says, a horse and mad fellow it was. Who do you think it was? And eventually Hamlet learns that this skull is the skull of the former court jester Yorick. Yorick, who has died recently, well, not recently, several years ago. And this becomes an occasion for Hamlet to reflect. And he says, holding the skull, and Horatio, his friend Horatio, is nearby. Holding the skull, he says, "Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred it is in my imagination. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table at a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning, quite chop-fallen? Now get you to my lady's table and tell her, let her paint an inch thick. To this favor must she come. Make her laugh at that." So that's Hamlet holding Yorick's skull and thinking about death, thinking about absent friends, thinking about Yorick's vanished vitality. How could someone so alive, so full of flashes of merriment, be gone? And this questioning of death continues. Hamlet is, of course, touching upon an older medieval tradition, the idea of memento mori, remember your death. And I'll give you all of that. I have a PPT as usual. But the main reason I came here is to be here in a graveyard and to talk about graveyard poetry. So that's what we're going to do. Before, what I'm going to do and what I'm going to end with today is a kind of reading of elegy written in a country churchyard. It should take about 7 to 8 minutes. But before that, I thought it's important that you get to know a little bit about this genre of graveyard poetry, because it doesn't begin with Gray's elegy. It begins much earlier. And here I am following, if you want you can buy the book, David Deashy's Critical History of English Literature, just to give you a sort of overview of where does graveyard poetry begin, what is it all about. So the influences that inform graveyard poetry, as I've said, stretch back centuries to the Ubi Sant tradition, to the Memento Mori tradition, through Renaissance drama. But in the 18th century, we start to read a certain kind of poetry which, quite contrary to the mood of certain earlier poems that came before in the Restoration as well as in the Augustan age, we start to see certain poets who are being more introspective, all right, who are presaging in various ways the genre of graveyard poetry. And I'll begin by talking about James Thomson. James Thomson, who wrote a very important work called Seasons in 1730. There were 4 volumes, winter, summer, spring and autumn, and it appeared over a period of several years. And what's important about Thomson's Seasons is, well, it contains the kind of longing for the countryside that becomes a feature of pre-romantic poetry and then later romantic poetry. But it also contains certain meditations on man and the human condition, which are also very important to understanding graveyard poetry. And so in many ways it presages romantic concerns. What you find in Thomson's Seasons is an interest in nature, but one that is allied to, or one that is mediated by certain Augustan conceptions, including that of the great chain of being and a Newtonian universe. So you have nature in the poem, but a nature ordered and mediated through certain Newtonian principles. But nonetheless, this forms the basis for, or forms the seed for a growing interest in certain kinds of local poetry. All right, poetry which takes off from, describes the countryside, describes the very immediate surrounding, and this becomes a kind of vogue. And Gray's Country Churchyard, Elegy in a Country Churchyard, is very much one of these. There are suggestions that it is drawing on Stoke Poges, an existing and actual graveyard. But what else is significant about Thomson? I would like to suggest that Thomson's Seasons contains meditations of a deeper nature and the deliberate cultivation of a kind of pensiveness. Okay, so nature, but nature as a space for contemplation, a space for pensive contemplation and meditation. All right. So, and if you read the some lines from his autumn section of Seasons, you can clearly see how this would influence Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. He begins, "Thus solitary and in pensive guise, oft let me wander o'er the russet mead, and through the saddened grove where scarce is heard one dying strain to cheer the woodman's toil." And it goes on, "O bear me then to vast embowering shades, to twilit groves and visionary vales, to weeping grottos and prophetic glooms, where angel forms athwart the solemn dusk, tremendous sweep or seem to sweep along, and voices more than human, through the void deep sounding, seize the enthusiastic ear." So you see much here that will also be seen in Gray's elegy, twilight groves, an atmosphere of gloom, of contemplation. Of course, he mentions angel forms because in Christian graveyards very often you will have above the grave itself, you can't really see it here because they're just plain crosses, but and I visited several graveyards when I was in the UK and Ireland, and very often, particularly in Catholic graveyards, you will have angels decorated above the gravestones, made of stone, angels decorated above the cross, and often indicating upwards, pointing upwards, because as I keep reminding you, Christianity is a religion in which there is a demarcation, and here is a gentleman who is watching me wondering what is this gentleman doing sitting here with a book talking to his phone, but I'm just going to ignore that. But the fact is that Christianity is a religion in which you have a kind of bicameral structure, a two-world structure. You have a mortal world within which there is no fulfillment of desire. It's a fallen world. Ever since the advent of the fall, there is no fulfillment to be found in this world. So the angels in graveyards, again, you don't see any here, but the angels are always pointing towards heaven, because heaven is posited as the only sort of timeless space where any kind of fulfillment can be found, where you know God, where you escape this veil of tears. Alright, so that's why the angels, again, I don't see any angels in this particular graveyard. But nonetheless, Thomson is important for us. Thomson is in many ways an Augustan because he moralizes. Nature becomes a kind of excuse for forming generalizations about human nature. And he has a sort of deistic vision of order as well. But at the same time, he in his feeling for the sights and sounds of the countryside, as well as the affectionate detail in which he describes the countryside, he very much looks ahead to the pre-romantics and then the romantics. All right. Again, what is significant in Thomson's Seasons is the detail with which he renders the countryside, and descriptive detail suggesting a mood. All right, so you have a coming together of a certain mood along with a kind of moralizing. All right. Another poem of his which is quite significant within this tradition is a poem called The Castle of Indolence, of which I'll read you just a small section because it reminded me of that quote that I had given you about retreat from history, John Sitter and retreat from history. It is again one of these melancholic introspective poems, and he says, "A pleasing land of drowsy head it was, of dreams that wave before the half-shut eye, and of gay castles in the clouds that pass, forever flushing round a summer sky. There eke the soft delights that witchingly instill a wanton sweetness through the breast, and the calm pleasures always hovered nigh. But whate'er smacked of annoyance or unrest was far, far off expelled from this delicious nest." So there is in this poem a kind of retreat from history, a kind of turn inwardness, away from the noise, away from the change that besets the external real world. Alright, so that's Thomson. There are a few other